Hi everybody, my name is Larsen. In this video I'm going to go over how you can play walking bass and chords on a B-flat blues. So I played and transcribed a one chorus example that I'm going to analyze, and I'm going to talk about how I made the bass lines, what kind of chord voicings I'm using, and talk a little bit about the techniques involved in playing it. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, so playing solos with interesting arpeggios and playing chord voicings with extensions, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. The first thing we should do is probably just to take a look at the example, and then I can break it down into smaller bits and pieces and talk about the components that it's constructed of. The way I'm playing this type of comping is sort of a combination of having the chords with the root as the lowest note, so you kind of need to stay in the area where you can play the chord, because if you want to add a chord, then there has to be one available, and most of the time you kind of need to have the root as the first note in the bass line on the bar, so you're kind of limited to the places where that happens, like this. For the rest, I'm trying to connect those with a bass line, and the bass line is then spelling out the chords that I'm on, so I'm keeping it kind of simple and just using fairly basic chord tones or scale tones of the chord that I'm on, and at the same time I'm thinking about where I'm going, so I'm trying to make a bass line that's going to logically move to the next note that I need to hit, which is often the root of the next chord. The first bar starts with a chord on the 1, so I'm playing this B flat 7 with a 13, drop 3 voicing that you probably already know, and the bass line is just the B flat major triad, so I'm playing the B flat here and then up to D, F, and then I have a leading note for the E flat, which is this E, and then I actually add another leading note, which is just to sort of create a little bit of variation in the bass line, because the walking bass line is of course essentially just quarter notes all the time. So, but here I'm adding an extra note just because it sort of breaks up the groove a bit, and that's a nice variation to have in there. So I start with the chord, up the triad, and then here I'm adding the third, because that's also a leading note, so now I have this sort of chromatic encircling of the E flat, and then I'm hammering on to the E flat, and then adding the chord afterwards, so you get this. And this just creates a lot of movement, which is kind of nice. It just breaks it up nicely, and that's a nice effect to have if you can get it in there. There are probably a few places you need to puzzle this out in advance and see if it's possible, and then you can have some variations of your bass lines where it works. So now I'm on the E flat, and here the bass line is also just using chord tone, so first the root chord, which is just so this E flat 7 with a 9 coming out of just an E flat shell voicing, down to the 7th, 5th, and then I want to go back to B flat in bar 3, and the B flat I want to play is actually this B flat shell voicing, and I'm using an A because that sort of fits the root, and then I can lead up to the B flat again. So my A leading note I'm harmonizing in this example, so I put an A7 under it, and then I can sort of just slide that up into my B flat 7. So here I have a B flat 7, now I'm not playing the 13, I'm just playing the shell voicing, and then same bass line, actually just B flat major triad, leading note, and now I'm going to F minor. I'm not going to E flat, but the E is still a valid leading note. So this is a good example of how you can have some bass lines that will actually take you to several different places. So instead of going down to the E flat, I can go up to F minor in bar 4. And the idea here is that I'm going to play F minor for half a bar, E7 for half a bar, to take me to the E flat in bar 5. And the way I do that is, so first the root, then the chord, and then the 5th, and then I move to the E7, chord, 5th. So really a simple idea, because I'm just playing this 2-5 with a tritone substitution and repeating the bass line, which is just 1-5, 1-5. Then I move to E flat, and here I play the chord on the 1. Also because we're sort of in a strong point in the song. So when you're coming from bar 4 to bar 5, so where you're in a new 4-bar period, then it often makes sense to put the chord on the 1 just to really state like now we're starting a new segment of the song. We tend to feel music in groups of 4 bars, and that is something to be sort of aware of when you're comping, whether it's with bass lines or without. That needs a sort of an emphasis in a certain way. You will hear also that if you listen for when drummers are making fills, it's usually at the end of some period and it'll come out at the beginning of the period. On the E flat 7, the next chord is an E diminished. So the bass line actually just kind of has to stay. We can use the root of the chord as a leading note up to the next chord, and that's kind of what I'm doing. So E flat down to the 7th, 5th. Again, just the bass lines are easy to play. And then sustain the chord at the same time. This has to be sort of practical solutions, because otherwise it gets way too difficult to play. And I'm using the E flat to lead up to the E diminished. And here's like first the E and then the chord. And then we get the bass line for that. That's just down to E flat, D flat, and then again an A as a leading note up to B flat. So we go back to B flat. And now it's B flat 13 again, but I'm playing it differently because I'm starting on the B flat and then the chord on the one hand. Again using the triad. And now I need to go to D half diminished. So instead of going to E, I go to E flat as a leading note down to D half diminished. And here I have this D half diminished drop 2 voicing. One of the few places where I'm using a drop 2 voicing, but it just fits really well to go from this. So root, chord, flat 5, which is a chord tone, down to the G7. And then here again adding the chord, and the voice leading of this works really well. And then a leading note to the C minor, which is a D flat. And here we get C minor with a 9. And that's again a 4-bar period, so I'm really stating it on the 1. And then I start to move up to the F. And that's just moving really from, so up the scale, C, D, E flat, and then a leading note, which is an E in this case. And then we're on the F. And then after the F we add the chord. So. And the leading note to go back down to the B flat in bar, let's see, that's bar 11. Is a B, and here again I'm harmonizing it. So now I'm harmonizing it so that it's going to resolve. It actually works as a tritone substitution as well, because it's a B7. And then I can just slide that whole thing down, and then I'm in the last turnaround. So on the B flat, again just using the shell voicing, and then up to the 5th, which I can use as a sort of diatonic leading note up to the G7 in the turnaround. So up to G, chord, and then I'm using a D flat as a leading note, down to C. Here I'm using this drop 3 C minor voicing, and then another leading note, which is a G flat, down to F, and then an F7 sharp 9, like this. So, and then the 5th, and then I'm back on the 1. A thing you should notice and maybe also try to incorporate into your walking bass and chord ideas is that you can use the chords in different ways. So I already talked about how it's important sometimes to really just state like on the 1 of a 4-bar period we have the chord and the bass note at the same time. And actually you want to sustain it. It's not really a short note, but if I play the first 2 bars then they sound like this. So here, of course, the first one is just there to really state now it's a B flat 7 blues, this is a B flat 7. the E flat, we kind of expect the B flat to come along, and already just having the bass note there is giving us most of the information that we need. So we can just use the chord there to just really state the groove, and it's just really sort of a short stab, like hitting the snare in a drum kit. And then we have the A7 here, which the point of that one is just to really emphasize that now we're going back to the 1, and it's just going to create some movement, and that's why it's played sustained, like. And then of course it makes most sense to also really resolve it, because otherwise it sounds like we're in a completely different key. And then in bar 4, so here we have first the F minor 7, which is maybe a little bit different from the B flat 7 that you might expect there. And after that we get the E7, which is a tritone substitution. And both of those chords are sort of important colors to introduce because they're a little bit different, and if you just play them really short, you don't really get the benefit of having them there in the first place. So those are played sustained. And then the same with the E7. And then because they're both played after the beat, but they're sustained, and we have a lot of tension building from both the fact that this is not on the beat and that it's a tritone substitution, it makes sense to really take it down and play the E flat 7 on the 1. So this way of thinking is also something that you can experiment with and think about when you maybe record yourself playing stuff like this. Does it sound like I could use long chords some places? Am I only playing one thing, or am I also sort of changing that up? Because I think that's an interesting thing to work with as well. And you want to have, even with something that is as limited as Walking Bass and Chords is, some amounts of variation and dynamics available, and I think this is a good thing to sort of look into. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improve the way you solo and comp, and this is the first time you see one of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video every Thursday, and I've been doing this for quite some time, so there's already really a lot of material available on my channel. This video is made possible by the support that I get from my patrons. I have a small community of people over on Patreon that are supporting my lessons, and if you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. If you support me on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. For instance, if you're supporting me from the $3 tier or up, for this week you get access to a lesson with another chorus of Walking Bass and Chords. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.